The ballroom of the Whitmore Foundation Gala fell silent the moment Lawrence Whitmore raised his voice. Crystal chandeliers glowed above hundreds of Boston's wealthiest donors as he pointed toward his wife. "Escort her out," he told security calmly, as if removing a stain from the evening. Yvonne Beckett Whitmore stood alone beneath the lights, her dignity stripped in front of cameras, executives, and reporters. She did not argue. She did not beg. She simply looked at him once, as if memorizing the moment. Lawrence believed he had just removed an inconvenience from his life. What he did not know was that the quiet woman he had just humiliated was the daughter of FBI Director Daniel Beckett. If you believe that truth has a way of returning when power is abused, stay with this story until the end. Before we continue, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. Stories like this travel far, and it's always powerful to see how many places are listening. And if you believe dignity matters, even when someone tries to take it away, consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss the next story. In Boston's Back Bay, reputation moved quietly but with enormous weight. A single invitation could change how a person was seen in the city's upper circles. A single rumor could erase years of carefully constructed respect. The people who understood this best rarely raised their voices. They managed perception the way a banker managed risk, slowly, carefully, and always with calculation. Lawrence Whitmore understood reputation better than most. At 39, he was the polished face of Whitmore Strategic Holdings, an investment and consulting firm that specialized in infrastructure partnerships and large municipal contracts. His firm appeared regularly in regional business journals. He spoke on panels about innovation and leadership. When photographs of Boston charity events appeared in magazines, Lawrence Whitmore was almost always present in the background, well-dressed, composed, smiling in a way that suggested quiet authority. People liked the idea of Lawrence Whitmore. He was articulate. He donated generously. He shook hands firmly and remembered names. And beside him, almost always slightly behind the camera's center line, stood his wife, Yvonne Beckett Whitmore. Where Lawrence filled a room with easy conversation, Yvonne moved through the same spaces with a quieter gravity. She was tall, composed and deliberate in her movements, as if she preferred to observe the shape of a moment before stepping into it. Her voice was calm and low when she spoke, and she rarely spoke at length. Those who met her at fundraisers often assumed she was shy. They noticed her listening more than talking. They noticed how she studied people's faces when they spoke, as if she were measuring something invisible beneath their words. Few people realized that this habit of observation had been part of her life for years. Yvonne worked remotely for a nonprofit policy research group based in Washington, D.C., analyzing the effectiveness of public safety grants and community funding programs. It was work that required patience, careful documentation, and a certain tolerance for reading between the lines of official reports. Numbers, patterns, and inconsistencies rarely intimidated her. In many ways, her professional life had trained her to notice what others ignored. From the outside, the Whitmore marriage looked nearly ideal. Their brownstone in Back Bay stood on a quiet tree-lined street where old brick buildings carried the quiet prestige of Boston's oldest neighborhoods. The interior was understated, but expensive dark wood floors, pale stone countertops, and art selected with the careful neutrality that interior designers favored for wealthy clients. They attended the right events. They appeared in the right photographs. Friends described them with a phrase Boston society used often when it wanted to signal approval. A very solid couple. But the truth of a marriage rarely appears in photographs. It reveals itself in smaller details, things too ordinary to attract attention, like how a conversation ends, like who apologizes, like who controls the accounts. In the first year of their marriage, Lawrence handled most of the finances. That arrangement seemed practical. His company dealt with large contracts and complicated investments. He already worked closely with accountants and financial advisors. Yvonne did not object. At the time, she saw it as efficiency. But gradually, the structure of their financial life began to shift in ways that were subtle enough to pass unnoticed. The joint account they once both accessed easily began requiring Lawrence's authorization for larger transfers. Credit cards were reissued under his primary account. Investment statements stopped arriving in the shared digital folder they had once used. None of these changes appeared dramatic on their own. Each one could be explained with a practical sentence. "It's easier if my office handles that." The accountants recommended consolidating. "It's temporary while we reorganize some investments." Yvonne never argued about money. Instead, she began doing something else. She started writing things down. At first, it was simply habit. Dates, transaction amounts, account numbers that appeared on statements before they disappeared again. She kept a small notebook in the back drawer of her desk, thin gray, almost indistinguishable from dozens of ordinary office notebooks. Inside, her handwriting remained neat and compact. March 12th. Joint account transfer restricted. April 3rd, credit card statement delayed. April 19th. Lawrence meeting with Whitmore finance team, no prior notice. The notes were not accusations. They were simply records, a pattern of observation. In the evenings, Lawrence often returned home late from meetings or networking events. Boston's business culture rewarded visibility, and Lawrence understood the value of appearing in as many professional rooms as possible. When he arrived home, he often carried the faint smell of expensive restaurants, wine-grilled meat-polished wood. Some nights he was talkative. Other nights he was distracted. But increasingly there was another quality beneath his behavior: impatience. It appeared first in small remarks. "You spend too much time worrying about details," he told her once while scanning emails at the kitchen counter. Another evening, when she asked about a new consulting contract he mentioned briefly, he replied, without looking up from his phone, "You wouldn't find it very interesting. It's complicated." The words themselves were mild. But tone often communicates more than language. The implication was clear. Certain areas of life belonged to him, and certain questions belonged to no one. Yvonne did not challenge him. Instead, she watched. When Lawrence spoke about business, his voice sometimes carried the careful vagueness of someone omitting pieces of a larger story. His explanations contained just enough information to sound complete, but rarely enough to answer follow-up questions. She noticed these gaps, and she wrote them down. Sometimes the notebook remained untouched for days. Other weeks it filled with quiet observations. May 8th. Lawrence withdrew $18,000 cash. May 8th, explanation consulting advance. May 10th, accountant call lasted 47 minutes. None of the entries proved anything, but they formed a timeline, and timelines had a way of revealing truth later. One evening in early summer, Yvonne met her old university friend Megan Carter for coffee near Boston Common. Megan worked as a corporate attorney and had the brisk, confident energy of someone used to negotiating difficult conversations. She greeted Yvonne with a long hug and a curious look. "You seem tired," Megan said as they sat near the cafe window. Yvonne stirred her coffee slowly. "I've just been working a lot." Megan studied her face the way lawyers sometimes study witnesses, carefully searching for what is not said. "And Lawrence?" Megan asked. Yvonne paused for a moment before answering. "He's busy." The answer was technically true. Megan leaned back slightly, her expression thoughtful. "Busy can mean a lot of things," she said. Yvonne offered a small smile. Most of them are probably accurate. The conversation drifted toward other topics: work, travel plans, mutual friends from university. But Megan's eyes occasionally returned to Yvonne with quiet concern. Something in Yvonne's calm felt heavier than usual. But Yvonne and I never complained. When they said goodbye outside the cafe, Megan squeezed her hand. "If you ever need anything," she said, "call me." Yvonne nodded. "I know." Later that night, back in the quiet brownstone, Yvonne opened the small gray notebook again. She added a new entry. June 4th. Megan asked about Lawrence. Then she paused. For a moment, she stared at the page as if deciding whether to write something else. Finally, she added one more line. Behavior pattern continuing. The notebook closed with a soft sound. Upstairs, Lawrence Whitmore sat in his office finishing a late call. His voice was low, controlled, confident. The voice of a man who believed he understood every variable in his life. Downstairs, Yvonne Beckett Whitmore placed the notebook carefully back into its drawer. Neither of them knew yet that the quiet habit she had begun recording details others ignored would eventually become the most dangerous thing in Lawrence Whitmore's carefully managed world, because patterns once documented long enough have a way of telling stories no one intended to reveal. Control rarely begins with commands. More often, it begins with adjustments, small changes introduced quietly enough that they appear reasonable. Over time, those changes accumulate until a person realizes the ground beneath them has shifted. Lawrence Whitmore understood this instinctively. He had built his professional life on negotiation leverage and timing. In business, he rarely forced outcomes directly. Instead, he adjusted conditions until the outcome he wanted became the only practical one. In his marriage, the same instinct began to surface. At first, the changes were subtle. One morning, Yvonne discovered that the second car, an Audi she had driven for nearly 2 years, was no longer listed under the household insurance policy. When she mentioned it casually over breakfast, Lawrence barely looked up from his phone. "Oh, right," he said. "The policy was getting expensive. My office consolidated the vehicles. If you need the car, just let me know ahead of time." It sounded efficient. But it meant something new. The car technically belonged to his company now. A week later, the household credit card declined when Yvonne tried to pay for groceries at a small market near their street. The cashier apologized awkwardly while other customers waited behind her. Yvonne paid with her personal debit card, without comment. When she mentioned the incident later that evening, Lawrence frowned as if the problem were administrative, rather than personal. "That card was restructured under the business account," he explained. "My finance team is reorganizing expenses. I'll have them issue you a new one." The new card arrived 3 weeks later. Its spending limit was significantly lower. Again, the explanation sounded practical. But practical changes have consequences. Yvonne began noticing how each adjustment slowly narrowed the number of things she could do without asking Lawrence first. Transportation, credit, access to certain shared accounts. None of these restrictions were announced as rules. They simply appeared through systems that Lawrence controlled. He never raised his voice when these changes happened. In fact, his tone often carried the faint patience of someone explaining logistics to a person who did not understand complex matters. "You don't need to worry about the financial side of things," he told her one evening while reviewing documents on his tablet. "That's my area." The phrase appeared more than once. My area. It was not shouted. It was stated. And statements have a way of shaping boundaries. Yvonne listened without argument, but she also continued documenting. Her gray notebook now contained several months of entries. Some of them were simple observations. July 2nd insurance change vehicle transferred to Whitmore Holdings. July 14th credit card declined, limit adjusted. July 28th. Lawrence private meeting with financial consultant unknown subject. The notes were factual. She avoided emotional language. There were no accusations in the notebook, only details. One afternoon, Yvonne sat at her desk reviewing public records related to her nonprofit research project when a notification appeared on her email. The message came from Lawrence. Subject line: account update. The message itself was brief. Consolidating investment accounts for tax planning. Accessed permissions adjusted temporarily. Yvonne opened the financial dashboard attached to the email. Several investment portfolios that had once appeared under their shared household profile were now listed as restricted. The access permissions column showed only one authorized user: Lawrence Whitmore. Yvonne closed the dashboard window slowly. Then she reached for the notebook. August 3rd investment accounts restricted. The entry took less than 10 seconds to write. But the moment lingered longer. She sat quietly for several minutes after closing the notebook, watching the soft afternoon light move across the floorboards of the study. Sometimes patterns become visible only after a certain number of repetitions. This pattern had now repeated enough times to form a shape. Control, not loud control, not violent control, but control through systems. Later that evening, Lawrence returned home later than usual. He carried a faint trace of cigar smoke on his jacket, something that had become more common in recent weeks. Yvonne noticed it immediately. Smell often reveals environments people do not describe. He poured himself a glass of whiskey in the kitchen and loosened his tie. "Long day," he said. Yvonne nodded slightly from the dining table where she was reading. "Client meetings. Something like that." He took a slow sip before continuing. "Actually, there's a new consulting group we've been working with. Some outside advisors helping restructure a few contracts." "What kind of advisors?" Yvonne asked. Lawrence shrugged lightly. "Operational consultants. They deal with complications." The word lingered. Complications. Yvonne looked at him carefully. "What kind of complications?" Lawrence gave a small, almost amused smile. "You're reading too much into it." Then he added the sentence he had begun using more often. "It's complicated business stuff." The conversation ended there. But something about the exchange stayed with Yvonne after Lawrence went upstairs to his office. Operational consultants. The phrase was vague enough to mean almost anything. She opened her laptop and searched public business registries for new consulting contracts connected to Whitmore Strategic Holdings. Nothing appeared immediately. That did not mean the contracts did not exist. It meant they were likely structured through private channels. Again, she wrote the detail down. August 12th. Lawrence mentions operational consultants. 2 days later, she met Megan Carter again, this time for a walk along the Charles River. The air was cooler now, early hints of autumn drifting through the city. They walked slowly along the path while rowers moved across the water in long, synchronized strokes. Megan glanced sideways at Yvonne after several minutes of silence. "You're doing that thing again," she said. "What thing?" "The observing thing." Yvonne smiled faintly. "I always observe." "Yes," Megan replied, "but lately you're observing like you're studying something." Yvonne considered the words before answering. "Maybe I am." Megan stopped walking and faced her. "Is Lawrence treating you badly?" The question arrived without drama, just direct concern. Yvonne looked toward the river for a moment, not in the way people usually mean that. "That's not a comforting sentence," Megan said quietly. Yvonne folded her hands together. "He's changing the structure of things. What things access? Decisions, information." Megan studied her carefully. Control. Yvonne did not answer immediately. Finally, she said, "It feels like he's narrowing the space around me." Megan's expression hardened slightly. "That's not normal, Yvonne." "No," Yvonne agreed softly. "It isn't." They resumed walking. After a moment, Megan asked, "What are you going to do about it?" Yvonne's answer was simple. "Watch." Megan raised an eyebrow. "Just watch for now." Megan shook her head slightly, though not in disagreement. "You always did play the long game." Yvonne's smile was small but genuine. Yes. What Megan did not know was that the long game had already begun. The notebook now contained nearly 70 entries. Dates, amounts, phrases, names mentioned casually during phone calls Lawrence thought she could not hear. One name had appeared twice recently. Victor. No last name yet. But repetition suggested significance. August 18th phone call, Lawrence mentions Victor handling it. August 21st. Lawrence leaving house says meeting with Victor. Names have gravity. Yvonne knew that. People rarely repeat names without reason. Upstairs, Lawrence Whitmore stood at his office window, speaking quietly into his phone. "Yes," he said. "I understand the arrangement." There was a pause. "No, she won't be a problem." Another pause. I just want the situation handled. He ended the call and looked out over the darkening street. In his mind, the path forward appeared clear. Problems could be solved, complications could be removed. All it required was the right people. Downstairs, Yvonne Beckett Whitmore opened her notebook one more time before going to bed. She wrote 2 final words beneath the previous entry: Victor, unknown role. Then she closed the notebook and turned off the lamp. Neither of them realized how quickly the quiet pattern of observation and control was approaching a point where one decision, just one, would transform a marriage into a criminal investigation. And when that moment arrived, it would not be loud. It would begin with a meeting and a choice. The meeting took place on a Tuesday night in South Boston. Lawrence Whitmore preferred locations that carried the illusion of privacy without actually appearing secretive. The restaurant he chose sat above the harbor, its windows looking out over dark water where cargo ships moved slowly beneath the distant lights of Logan Airport. Inside the restaurant catered to people who conducted business that did not belong in offices. Soft jazz drifted through the room. Waiters moved quietly between tables where conversations were held in low voices that rarely carried beyond the edges of their booths. Lawrence arrived 10 minutes early. Punctuality was part of his professional discipline. When dealing with unfamiliar people, he preferred to control the first moments of an interaction. He chose a corner booth where he could see both the entrance and the hallway leading toward the private lounge. When the man arrived, he did not rush. Victor Hale walked into the restaurant with the relaxed confidence of someone who understood how attention worked. He wore a dark jacket over a plain shirt, the kind of clothing that made a person look ordinary at first glance. But there was nothing particularly ordinary about Victor Hale. He was in his mid-40s, tall, with a calm expression that rarely changed. The staff greeted him with quiet familiarity, suggesting he had been here many times before. Victor slid into the booth across from Lawrence and nodded politely. "Mr. Whitmore, Mr. Hale." They shook hands briefly. Victor's grip was steady but unremarkable. A waiter appeared and Victor ordered bourbon without opening the menu. Lawrence declined a drink. Business first. Victor leaned back slightly and studied Lawrence for a moment. "I understand you were referred by someone who trusts my discretion." Lawrence nodded. "A mutual associate from a development project in Hartford." Victor's lips curved into a small, neutral smile. "Yes, I know the one." Neither man spoke the associate's name. In conversations like this, names often remained unnecessary. Victor rested one arm along the back of the booth. So he said quietly, "What kind of problem are we discussing?" Lawrence paused briefly before answering. He had rehearsed this conversation in his mind several times during the previous week. "There's a personal complication," he said. Victor's expression remained calm. "Complications come in different forms." Lawrence folded his hands on the table. "My wife." Victor did not appear surprised. In what way? Lawrence chose his words carefully. "She's become unstable." Victor waited. Silence can encourage people to reveal more than they intend. Lawrence continued. "She's interfering with certain financial matters that she doesn't fully understand. It's creating risk. For my business. For my reputation." Victor nodded slowly. "And what exactly are you hoping to accomplish?" Lawrence leaned slightly forward. "I need the situation resolved." Victor lifted his glass as the waiter placed the bourbon in front of him. Resolved how Lawrence spoke without hesitation. "She needs to understand that remaining in my life is not in her best interest." Victor took a slow sip of bourbon before answering. "There are many ways people come to understand things." Lawrence held his gaze. "I'm not asking for anything permanent." Victor's eyes remained steady. "That's good," he said calmly. "Permanent solutions tend to create unnecessary attention." The conversation paused for a moment while the sounds of the restaurant moved quietly around them. Finally, Victor asked, "What outcome would satisfy you?" Lawrence spoke the words carefully. "She leaves the house. She leaves the marriage. And she doesn't make a scene about it." Victor nodded slightly. "That's more straightforward." He placed the glass back on the table. There would need to be a demonstration, something convincing enough to change her perspective. Lawrence's voice remained controlled. I assumed as much. Victor leaned forward slightly now, lowering his voice. I work with two men who specialize in persuasive situations. Lawrence did not react outwardly. What kind of men? Reliable ones. Victor's tone remained almost conversational. Raymond Castillo and Darren Pike. Lawrence had never heard the names before. They understand instructions, Victor continued, and they know how to avoid unnecessary attention. Lawrence considered the information carefully. And what would something like this cost? Victor smiled faintly. That depends on the level of persuasion required. Lawrence answered quickly, enough to make the message clear. Victor studied him for a moment. Then he named a number. It was large, but not large enough to make Lawrence hesitate. That's acceptable, Lawrence said. Victor nodded, half in advance, half after the situation is resolved. Lawrence had expected that structure. There's one condition, Victor added. Lawrence raised an eyebrow. No police involvement, no unexpected complications. If your wife has connections that might create problems, I need to know now. Lawrence almost smiled. She doesn't. Victor held his gaze for a moment longer, as if measuring the truth behind the statement. Finally, he nodded. Good. Lawrence reached into his briefcase and removed a slim folder. Inside was a printed consulting invoice. The document listed a payment request from a small firm called Hale Operational Advisory Group. The service description read, simply, strategic risk consultation. Victor glanced at the document and gave a soft chuckle. You're thorough. Lawrence slid the folder across the table. The transfer will process tomorrow. Victor accepted the folder without opening it. Once the payment clears, he said calmly, we'll begin. Lawrence leaned back slightly. How soon Victor's answer came without hesitation. Within the week. The conversation ended there. They finished the meeting with the same polite restraint with which it had begun. Two businessmen concluding an agreement. No raised voices, no threats, just logistics. When Lawrence stepped outside the restaurant, the harbor air felt colder than it had earlier. But he felt something else as well. Relief. In his mind, the situation had now moved from uncertainty to solution. His wife would receive a clear message. She would leave quietly. The problem would disappear. Inside the restaurant, Victor Hale remained seated for several minutes after Lawrence left. He opened the folder and examined the invoice carefully. Then he pulled out his phone and sent a brief message. Payment incoming. Job confirmed. Across the city, Raymond Ray Castillo read the message while sitting in a parked car outside a bar in Dorchester. Ray was a broad-shouldered man in his late 30s with a shaved head and a faded tattoo along his wrist. He looked at the phone, then at the man sitting beside him. Darren Pike, younger, nervous energy, a thin scar along his jaw. Ray showed him the message. Darren frowned. What's the job? Ray shrugged. Rich guy problem. Darren leaned back in his seat. Those are usually easy. Ray started the car. Yeah, he said quietly. They usually are. Back in Back Bay, Yvonne Beckett Whitmore sat alone in the living room of the brownstone. The house was quiet. Lawrence had texted earlier to say he would be home late. Client meeting. She had heard that explanation many times. But tonight, something about the silence felt heavier than usual. She opened her notebook and reviewed the entries from the past 2 weeks. Victor. The name appeared 3 times now. Names that repeat often deserve attention. Yvonne wrote one more line. August 24th, Lawrence meeting Victor tonight. Then she paused for a moment. Sometimes the difference between suspicion and certainty lies in patience. She closed the notebook and placed it carefully back in the drawer. Upstairs, the house remained still. Across the city, 2 men had already begun planning how they would deliver a message that Lawrence Whitmore believed would solve his problem. What none of them yet understood was that the decision made in that quiet restaurant booth had already crossed a boundary that could not be uncrossed. And once certain lines are crossed, the consequences no longer belong to the person who made the decision. They belong to the law. The night it happened, Boston was wrapped in the quiet humidity of late August. The city carried the heavy stillness that arrives before autumn begins pushing the summer air away. Traffic moved slowly along the streets near downtown, and the lights of office buildings reflected faintly across the Charles River. Yvonne Beckett Whitmore left the nonprofit research office she occasionally visited in Cambridge a little after 9 that evening. Most of her work could be done remotely, but every few weeks she preferred to review certain documents in person with her team. It helped her see patterns more clearly when she could spread files across a real table instead of a computer screen. The building's parking structure sat beneath the office complex 3 concrete levels deep. As she walked down the stairwell toward level B, the sound of her footsteps echoed softly against the walls. The garage was nearly empty at that hour. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Rows of parked cars sat in long shadows beneath the concrete ceiling. Yvonne moved calmly toward her car. Her mind was still occupied with a funding analysis she'd been reviewing earlier numbers that did not quite align with the projected distribution of a municipal grant. Patterns again. She unlocked the car remotely, and the headlights flashed once in acknowledgement. The sound was small but noticeable in the quiet space. At the far end of the garage, another car door closed. Yvonne glanced briefly in that direction. 2 men stepped out from behind a concrete pillar. At first, nothing about the scene appeared immediately threatening. People often returned to parking garages late at night. But something in the way the men walked changed the atmosphere of the space. They were moving toward her. Not quickly, not slowly, just directly. Yvonne felt the shift instantly. Human instinct often detects danger before the mind explains it. She continued walking toward her car, her pace unchanged. But she began observing. The taller man, broad shoulders, shaved head. The other, leaner, restless movements. They approached without speaking. When they were within several steps of her car, the taller man spoke first. Evening. His voice carried the rough edge of someone accustomed to being heard. Yvonne stopped beside her car door. Yes. The leaner man stepped slightly behind her, blocking the open space of the garage aisle. The positioning was deliberate. The taller man took one more step closer. Mrs. Whitmore. It was not a question. Yvonne's mind registered the detail immediately. They knew her name. "How can I help you?" she asked calmly. The taller man tilted his head slightly. "You can help by listening." His voice lowered. "Your husband asked us to deliver a message." For a moment, the words hung in the humid air of the garage. Yvonne did not react outwardly. But inside, something settled. A quiet confirmation. The leaner man spoke next. "You've been causing problems?" Yvonne looked at him briefly. "What kind of problems?" The taller man answered. "The kind that end marriages." There was a pause. Then the taller man reached forward and shoved her hard against the side of the car. The impact knocked the breath from her chest. Pain radiated through her shoulder as metal met bone. The leaner man moved quickly, grabbing her arm before she could steady herself. "Listen carefully," he said. "Your husband wants you gone." The words were delivered with clinical indifference. This is the polite version. The taller man struck her once across the ribs. Not wildly, precisely. Pain exploded through her side. But even as the pain surged, Yvonne's mind continued recording details. The taller man's accent, slight East Coast urban. The tattoo on his wrist. A faded black line forming what looked like a broken compass. The leaner man smelled faintly of gasoline and cheap cologne. "You're going to leave," he continued. "House, marriage, everything." Another shove pushed her back against the car door. "You do it quietly," the taller man said. "And you stay quiet." The leaner man leaned closer. "If you don't, next time isn't a warning." The words were simple, professional. This was not rage. This was instruction. Yvonne looked directly at the taller man. "What are your names?" the question caught him off guard. For a fraction of a second, confusion crossed his face. Then he laughed. That's not part of the conversation. The leaner man grabbed her shoulder again and forced her to the ground. Concrete scraped against her palms. Pain spread across her ribs where the earlier blow had landed. The taller man crouched briefly beside her. Your husband thinks you're smart enough to understand the message, he said. Then he stood. Don't prove him wrong. The two men walked away as calmly as they had arrived. Their footsteps echoed through the garage as they disappeared toward a dark sedan parked several rows away. The engine started. Headlights swept briefly across the concrete walls. Then the car drove out of the garage. Silence returned. For several seconds, Yvonne remained where she had fallen. Her breathing came slowly, carefully. Pain pulsed along her ribs with each inhale. But nothing felt broken, not seriously. After a moment, she pushed herself upright, using the side of the car. The fluorescent lights above continued humming, as if nothing unusual had occurred. Yvonne leaned against the door and closed her eyes briefly. Not in despair, in concentration, memory. The taller man, tattoo, compass design. The leaner one, scar along the jaw, gasoline smell. She repeated the details silently in her mind. Repetition fixed information in place. When she opened her eyes again, she reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. Her hands trembled slightly from the adrenaline. But her voice remained steady when she called emergency services. I've been assaulted, she said calmly, when the operator answered. She gave the location, the description, the timeline. Within minutes, the distant sound of sirens began echoing through the streets above the garage. An ambulance arrived first. The paramedic who examined her ribs frowned. Looks like you took a pretty hard hit, he said gently. They wanted to make a point, Yvonne replied quietly. At the hospital, the doctors confirmed what she already suspected. Bruised ribs, deep bruising along her shoulder and back. No fractures. The police officer who took her statement asked the standard questions. Did you recognize the attackers? No. Did they say anything? Yvonne paused for a moment. Yes. What did they say? She looked directly at the officer. They said my husband asked them to deliver a message. The officer's pen stopped briefly over the notepad. Your husband, that's what they said. The officer wrote the statement down without comment, but his expression had changed slightly. Across town, Lawrence Whitmore sat in his office reviewing emails when his phone rang. The number belonged to Boston Medical Center. He listened quietly as the nurse explained the situation. Yes, he said after a moment. I'll come immediately. He ended the call and sat still for several seconds. The message had been delivered, but something in the nurse's voice had suggested more attention than he expected. At the hospital, son Lawrence arrived with carefully measured concern. He entered Yvonne's room with a worried expression already prepared. My God, he said softly. What happened? Yvonne lay propped slightly upright in the hospital bed. Her face carried faint bruising along one cheek. Her eyes studied him calmly. I was attacked in the parking garage. Lawrence shook his head slowly. That's terrible. He stepped closer. Did they take anything? No. He hesitated. Did they say anything? Yvonne held his gaze for several seconds. Yes. Lawrence waited. They said you asked them to deliver a message. The words hung quietly between them. Lawrence's expression shifted just slightly. Not panic, not yet. Just a brief tightening of the jaw. Then he shook his head with controlled disbelief. That's absurd. Yvonne did not argue. She simply watched him. Sometimes silence reveals more than accusation. Outside the hospital room, the police officer finished writing his report. Inside the room, Lawrence Whitmore continued playing the role of concerned husband. But somewhere beneath the performance, a small crack had begun forming. Because the message he had ordered had been delivered. But the woman he expected to break was not breaking. And that was not part of the plan. Hospitals have a way of compressing time. Hours pass in quiet intervals, machines humming footsteps, moving down hallways, distant conversations behind thin curtains. Pain dulls slowly under medication, but clarity often sharpens in the silence. Yvonne Beckett Whitmore spent the night in that quiet clarity. The bruising along her ribs made every breath shallow. When she shifted slightly in the bed, the pain radiated through her side in slow pulses. But pain had never been the thing that frightened her most. Uncertainty was. And the uncertainty had now begun to disappear. By morning, the events of the previous night had arranged themselves in her mind with the precision of a timeline. The men knew her name. They spoke about her husband. They delivered instructions, not random violence. The pattern was clear. Across the room, Lawrence Whitmore sat in a chair near the window, scrolling occasionally through his phone. He had remained at the hospital through the night, speaking to nurses, thanking doctors, and answering brief questions from the police officer who returned for follow-up details. To anyone observing the scene, Lawrence appeared exactly as a devoted husband should appear: concerned, attentive, protective. But appearances are often constructed through performance, and performances require careful timing. At mid-morning, Lawrence stood and walked to the side of Yvonne's bed. "The doctor said you can be discharged this afternoon," he said. Yvonne nodded slightly. "That's good." He hesitated before continuing. "You'll probably need to rest for a while." "Probably." The conversation remained polite, almost formal. After a moment, Lawrence added, "We should talk when we get home." Yvonne looked at him quietly. About what? Lawrence exhaled slowly. About everything. The word carried weight. Everything. Yvonne did not press further. "All right," she said simply. The discharge paperwork was completed shortly after noon. A nurse handed Yvonne a small envelope containing medical instructions and prescriptions for pain medication. When they stepped outside the hospital entrance, the afternoon sun reflected sharply off the glass buildings across the street. For a brief moment, the brightness forced Yvonne to narrow her eyes. Lawrence opened the passenger door of his car. The drive back to Back Bay passed mostly in silence. Boston traffic moved steadily along Commonwealth Avenue as cyclists and pedestrians filled the sidewalks in the late summer warmth. Lawrence kept both hands on the steering wheel. His posture remained controlled, but his jaw tightened occasionally, as if he were rehearsing something in his mind. When they arrived at the brownstone, he parked and walked around the car to help Yvonne out. She accepted the gesture without comment. Inside the house, the familiar quiet returned. The rooms were exactly as they had been before the attack. Furniture arranged carefully. Books stacked neatly on tables. A vase of fresh flowers stood in the entryway delivered that morning by a florist whose card read simply, "Get well soon." Lawrence closed the front door behind them. Then he spoke. "We need to talk." Yvonne removed her coat slowly and placed it over the back of a chair. "I thought that's what you said." Lawrence walked into the living room and gestured toward the sofa. "Sit down." Yvonne sat carefully protecting her injured ribs. Lawrence remained standing for a moment before taking the chair opposite her. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Finally, Lawrence broke the silence. "This situation isn't sustainable anymore." Yvonne waited. "I think it's best if we separate." The sentence landed quietly in the room. No raised voice, no anger, just a statement. Yvonne studied his face. "You've decided that?" "Yes." "And when did you make that decision?" Lawrence folded his hands. "Recently." Yvonne nodded once. "I see." He continued quickly, as if wanting the words finished before hesitation could interrupt them. "You'll need to move out." The room remained still. "The house is under my company's ownership structure," he explained. "Legally, it's easier if you relocate." "And where would you suggest I go?" Lawrence shrugged slightly. "You have friends." The answer arrived without emotion. Yvonne watched him carefully. "What about the joint accounts? They've been restructured." "What about my access to them?" Lawrence's voice became firmer. There isn't any. The truth now appeared without disguise. Yvonne did not argue. Instead, she asked another question. Was the attack part of this plan? The question arrived calmly. Lawrence's eyes hardened. That's a ridiculous accusation. They said you sent them. Criminals say many things. Yvonne held his gaze. You hired them. Lawrence stood abruptly. I'm not discussing that. He walked toward the kitchen, then turned back. What matters is that this marriage is over. The words echoed through the room. Yvonne remained seated. And if I refuse, Lawrence gave a small, cold smile. You won't. Why are you so certain? Because last night wasn't the last warning. The sentence slipped out before he could stop it. Silence followed. For a moment, even Lawrence seemed to realize what he had revealed. But he quickly recovered. You need to pack a bag, he said sharply. Tonight. Yvonne stood slowly, steadying herself against the edge of the table. Pain flashed through her ribs, but her expression remained composed. She walked upstairs without another word. Lawrence stayed in the living room, pacing once across the floor before stopping near the window. From the outside, the street looked peaceful. Cars parked neatly along the curb, neighbors walking their dogs. Nothing about the quiet Boston afternoon suggested that a marriage had just collapsed inside one of its historic homes. Upstairs, Yvonne moved carefully through the bedroom. She opened the closet and removed a small suitcase. Her movements were slow, deliberate. A few changes of clothing, her laptop, important documents from a locked drawer. Finally, she opened the desk and removed the gray notebook. For a moment, she held it in her hands. Every entry inside now carried new meaning. She placed it carefully in her bag. Then she closed the suitcase. When she returned downstairs, Lawrence was standing near the front door. That was quick, he said. I don't need much. He nodded once. Good. He walked to the security panel beside the door and entered a new code. The keypad beeped softly. I'll be updating the system tonight, he said. Your access will be removed. Yvonne listened. My credit card's canceled. My phone, you can keep it. The generosity sounded almost sarcastic. Yvonne lifted her suitcase. Then I suppose this is goodbye. Lawrence opened the door. For now. She stepped onto the sidewalk. The late afternoon air carried the distant sound of traffic and the faint smell of the harbor. Behind her, the door closed. The electronic lock clicked. Inside the house, Lawrence Whitmore believed he had finally regained control of his life. The problem had been removed. The message had been delivered. The marriage was finished. But as Yvonne Beckett Whitmore walked slowly down the quiet street, she reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. She scrolled briefly through her contacts. Then she stopped at one name, Daniel Beckett. For years, she had avoided using that number to solve problems. She had built her adult life carefully, without leaning on the weight of her father's position. But some situations no longer belonged to private restraint. She pressed the call button. On the other side of the country, in Washington, D.C., a secure office phone began to ring. And when the man who answered heard his daughter's voice, the quiet chain of events Lawrence Whitmore believed he controlled would begin moving in a direction he had never imagined. The phone rang only twice before it was answered. Daniel Beckett. The voice was calm, direct, and unmistakably disciplined. Yes. Years in federal service had shaped the way he spoke. Every word, deliberate, every pause measured. For a brief moment, Yvonne did not respond. It had been months since she had called her father directly. Their relationship had never been distant, but both of them had long understood a quiet boundary between family and the responsibilities that came with his position. He had taught her that boundary herself. Finally, suddenly she spoke. Hi, Dad. On the other end of the line, the tone of the room changed instantly. Daniel Beckett recognized something in her voice. Not panic, not fear, but strain. Yvonne, he said quietly. Where are you, Boston? Are you safe right now? Yes. He paused. Are you alone? Yes. Another pause followed. Tell me what happened. Yvonne sat on a bench along the quiet street a few houses away from the brownstone. Evening had begun settling over Back Bay, and the soft glow of street lamps was beginning to appear along the sidewalks. She spoke slowly, carefully, not emotionally, factually. There was an assault last night, she said. 2 men in a parking garage. Daniel Beckett did not interrupt. Did you report it? He asked. Yes. Boston police took a statement. Are you injured? Bruised ribs. Nothing broken. There was a silence on the line. Then he asked the question that mattered most. What did the attackers say? Yvonne took a breath. They said Lawrence hired them to deliver a message. Another pause. Longer this time. Daniel Beckett did not react immediately. People often imagine federal investigators responding to information with anger or dramatic declarations. In reality, the first response was usually something else. Analysis. Did they identify themselves? He asked. No. Did they mention names? No. Did they threaten you directly? Yes. What exactly did they say? Yvonne repeated the words as precisely as she could remember. Her father listened without interruption. When she finished, he asked quietly, Do you believe your husband was involved? Yes. The certainty in her voice was calm. Daniel Beckett absorbed that answer. Do you have evidence? He asked. Not yet. Any documentation leading up to this? Yvonne looked down at the bag beside her. Yes. Explain. I've been keeping records, she said. Of what financial changes? Conversations? Names? What name's one that keeps repeating? Which one, Victor? Daniel Beckett leaned back in his chair in Washington. His office overlooked a quiet courtyard inside the FBI headquarters building, but at the moment, he was not seeing the view. He was reconstructing a timeline. You said you left the house, he said. Yes. Where are you staying tonight? I haven't decided yet. Stay where you are for the moment. His voice remained steady. Yvonne. Yes. You need to understand something clearly. I do. This cannot become a personal matter. I know. If your husband committed a crime, it must be handled through proper channels. That's why I called you. Another pause followed. Then Daniel Beckett said quietly, Good. He reached for a notepad on his desk. First, I want you to write down everything you remember from the attack, every detail, even small ones. I already started. Good. Second, he continued, I need to know exactly what documentation you have. Email records, financial changes, notes about meetings, names, yes, dates, yes, good. Daniel Beckett wrote several lines quickly. Listen carefully, he said. I'm not personally investigating this. I wouldn't expect you to. But I will make sure the right people see it. Okay. And those people will treat this exactly the way they would treat any other criminal allegation. That's all I want. Daniel Beckett placed the pen down. For a moment, father and daughter sat in silence on opposite ends of the country. Finally, he spoke again. Where are you exactly? Yvonne gave him the street name. Stay there, he said. Someone will meet you shortly. Who? A federal agent based in Boston. Already I'm making the call now. He hesitated briefly. Yvonne. Yes, I'm glad you called. Her voice softened slightly. Me too. He ended the call. For several seconds, Daniel Beckett remained seated without moving. From the outside, he appeared exactly the same as he always did, composed, controlled, analytical. But the lines of concentration around his eyes had deepened. His daughter had just described a crime. And if the facts were correct, the crime involved hired violence. He reached for another phone on his desk. This one connected through internal federal lines. The call was answered almost immediately. Office of the Assistant United States Attorney. This is Daniel Beckett. There was a brief pause. Director Beckett, how can we assist you? I need to speak with Michael Torres. Moments later, another voice came on the line. Michael Torres. Michael, it's Daniel Beckett, Director. I'm calling about a potential assault for hire case in Boston. Torres did not ask unnecessary questions. Do you have preliminary details? Yes, send them. I will. Torres's tone remained professional. Do you want federal involvement at this stage? I want the facts evaluated. Understood. Daniel Beckett continued. There may also be financial elements tied to the case. Torres wrote something down. That helps. I'll also connect you with one of our Boston field agents, Daniel said. Named Claire Donovan. Torres nodded, even though Beckett could not see him. Good agent, I know. The call ended shortly afterward. Within minutes, Special Agent Claire Donovan received a message requesting immediate contact with Director Beckett. Claire Donovan was known within the Boston field office for two qualities: patience and an unusual ability to read people during interviews. When she returned the call, Daniel Beckett explained the situation in the same controlled tone he had used earlier. No emotional language, no accusations, only facts. At the end of the explanation, Claire asked a simple question. Do you want me to meet your daughter tonight? Yes. Location. He gave her the address. Claire stood from her desk immediately. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Back in Back Bay, Yvonne remained seated on the bench watching the slow movement of evening traffic along the street. Her suitcase sat beside her. The city around her continued its ordinary rhythm. Couples walked past. A cyclist rolled by with headphones on. No one noticed the quiet woman sitting beneath the street lamp. 20 minutes later, a dark sedan pulled slowly to the curb. A woman stepped out. Mid-30s, professional posture, observant eyes. She approached calmly. Yvonne Beckett, yes. The woman extended her hand. Special Agent Claire Donovan. Yvonne shook it. Claire studied her briefly, noticing the faint bruising along her cheek and the careful way she moved when standing. I understand you've had a difficult night, Claire said. Yvonne nodded once. I have information, she replied. Claire gestured toward the car. Let's talk somewhere quiet. As they drove away from the street, the first threads of a federal investigation were beginning to form. Not because of power, not because of influence, but because Yvonne Beckett had done something most victims of manipulation never had the chance to do. She had documented everything. And once documentation meets procedure, truth becomes very difficult to bury. Special Agent Claire Donovan did not begin with questions. Instead, she began with silence. The sedan moved slowly through the evening streets of Boston, while the city lights reflected across the windshield in long streaks of gold and white. Claire drove without urgency, allowing the quiet space inside the car to settle naturally. People often reveal more when they are not rushed. After several minutes, she spoke. Are you comfortable continuing tonight? Yvonne sat in the passenger seat, one hand resting carefully against her ribs. Yes. Claire nodded once. There's a small federal office about 10 minutes from here. It's quieter than the main field office. That's fine. When they arrived, the building looked almost ordinary, an unremarkable government structure with tinted windows and minimal signage. The security inside was efficient but discreet. Claire guided Yvonne through a side entrance and into a small interview room. A table, 2 chairs, a recording device resting quietly in the center. Claire did not turn the recorder on yet. Instead, she sat down across from Yvonne and folded her hands calmly on the table. Before we begin formally, Claire said, I want to understand how prepared you are for what comes next. Yvonne looked at her steadily. What do you mean? Claire leaned back slightly. If your husband arranged the assault you described, we will investigate it as a federal crime. That process takes time. It also involves scrutiny. Yvonne listened. Your life, Claire continued, will be examined in detail. Your communications, finances, relationships. That's fine. Claire watched her carefully. It's not always comfortable. I understand. Claire paused for a moment. Why did you start documenting things before the attack? Yvonne did not hesitate, because I noticed patterns. What kind of patterns, Control? Claire waited. Yvonne continued. Financial restrictions, changes in access, unexplained meetings. How long have you been documenting this? 6 months. Claire's eyebrows lifted slightly. That's unusually thorough. Yvonne reached down and placed the gray notebook on the table. I like records. Claire looked at the notebook for a moment before opening it. The pages were filled with precise handwriting. Dates, transaction notes, short descriptions of conversations. Claire flipped slowly through several entries. "This is extremely useful," she said quietly. She closed the notebook and finally reached toward the recorder. "I'm going to turn this on now." Yvonne nodded. The recorder clicked softly as Claire began. Interview with Yvonne Beckett regarding alleged assault and related events. Date, August 26th. Location, Boston Federal Satellite Office. She looked up. "Please describe the attack in your own words." Yvonne spoke clearly. She described the parking garage, the two men, their positioning, their voices. Claire asked specific questions. What did the taller man look like? Broad shoulders, shaved head, tattoo on his wrist. What kind of tattoo? A broken compass design. Claire wrote that detail down. And the second man's scar along his jaw. Nervous movements. Anything else? He smelled like gasoline. Claire nodded. Small details often mattered. After the attack description ended, Claire moved to the next section. "You mentioned financial irregularities involving your husband." "Yes, explain." Yvonne described the gradual changes to their accounts, the removal of her access, the consulting invoice she had seen briefly. Claire leaned forward slightly. "What consulting invoice a company called Hale Operational Advisory?" Claire wrote the name carefully. "Do you have a copy?" "No." "Do you remember the amount?" "Yes." Yvonne named the number. Claire's pen paused briefly. "That's a significant transfer." "I thought so too." "Did your husband explain the payment? He said it was for operational consulting." Claire nodded slowly. "Do you believe that payment is connected to the men who attacked you?" "Yes." Claire turned the page in her notebook. "You also mentioned a name, Victor." "Yes. Full name I don't know. Context, my husband mentioned him during phone calls. Also before a meeting." Claire circled the name Victor. How recently, 2 days before the attack. Claire closed the notebook for a moment. The pieces were beginning to arrange themselves into a recognizable structure. Money, a middleman, hired violence. She had seen similar cases before. But this one carried an unusual element. The victim had already built half the timeline. Claire turned the recorder off briefly. "This is good work," she said quietly. Yvonne looked at her. "I didn't start it for this." Claire smiled faintly. People rarely do. She stood and walked toward the door. "I need to make a few calls." "Okay." Claire stepped into the hallway and dialed a number from memory. Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Torres answered. "Torres, it's Donovan. Already working, yes." "What do you have?" Claire spoke calmly. "Victim statement consistent with targeted assault. Evidence documentation of financial restructuring. And a suspicious consulting payment." How suspicious? Claire named the amount. Torres exhaled slowly. "That's enough to get attention. There's also a middleman name. Who? Victor. Possibly connected to Hale Operational Advisory." Torres typed quickly. "Send me the notes. I will." Torres continued. "If we can link that payment to known operators, we have a conspiracy case. That's what I'm thinking. Any suspects for the actual attacker's descriptions only." Torres paused. "That's fine." "What's next?" Claire asked. Torres answered without hesitation. "Follow the money." Claire nodded. "That was my plan." Back in the interview room, Yvonne remained seated quietly. When Claire returned, she carried 2 cups of coffee. She placed one on the table. "You're helping us build a timeline," Claire said. "That's good. But we need to confirm everything. How financial records, phone records, surveillance footage." Yvonne considered that. There were cameras in the parking garage. Claire smiled slightly. "That helps." She sat down again. "Your husband probably believes the attack frightened you into silence." Yvonne did not answer. Claire studied her. "He doesn't realize you've already documented most of the events leading up to it." "No." Claire opened the notebook again. "This kind of documentation changes everything. How because accusations are weak," Claire said. "But timelines are powerful." Yvonne looked at the pages quietly. For 6 months, Claire continued. You've been building a record of behavior. She tapped the notebook gently. Now we connect that behavior to money, and the money to people, and the people to the assault. Yvonne nodded. Claire leaned back in her chair. It won't happen overnight. That's fine. Claire studied her for a moment. You're very calm. I've had time to think. About what? About patterns. Claire gave a small, approving nod. Patterns are exactly what we follow. Outside the small office, Boston continued its quiet nighttime rhythm. Inside, the first structured steps of a criminal case had begun to take shape. Because once investigators begin connecting money to actions, the distance between suspicion and proof begins shrinking rapidly. And somewhere in the city, Lawrence Whitmore was still sleeping peacefully. Believing the message he ordered had solved his problem. He had no idea that the woman he tried to silence had just handed federal investigators the most valuable thing they could receive at the beginning of an investigation. A map. And every line of that map was pointing back toward him. The first sign that something was shifting did not come from the police. It came from the bank. 3 days after the attack, Lawrence Whitmore was sitting in his office reviewing quarterly projections when his assistant knocked lightly on the door. Mr. Whitmore. Yes, there's someone from Commonwealth Financial online too. They said it's regarding a transaction review. Lawrence frowned slightly. Transaction reviews were routine in the world of corporate finance. Large transfers often triggered automatic compliance checks, particularly when consulting firms or external contractors were involved. Still, the timing irritated him. Put them through. A moment later, a polite voice came through the speaker. Mr. Whitmore, this is Daniel Kerr from Commonwealth Financial Compliance. Lawrence leaned back in his chair. Yes, Mr. Kerr. How can I help you? We're conducting a routine verification on a recent outgoing payment from Whitmore Strategic Holdings. Which payment? A consulting invoice issued to Hale Operational Advisory Group. For a fraction of a second, Lawrence felt a faint tightening in his chest, but his voice remained steady. Yes, that was a consulting engagement. Understood. We just need to confirm the service classification for our records. Lawrence answered smoothly. Strategic Risk Consulting. Thank you. And the nature of the consultation contract dispute resolution? Daniel Kerr typed something. Very good. One more question. Was the consultation conducted in person? Yes. Location, Boston. Thank you for your time, Mr. Whitmore. The call ended. Lawrence stared at the silent phone for several seconds. Compliance questions were normal, but the timing was inconvenient. He leaned forward and opened his email. There was no indication yet that the bank suspected anything unusual. Still, a quiet instinct in the back of his mind began calculating possibilities. If the attack had drawn police attention, there was always a chance the investigation could brush against financial records. But Victor Hale had assured him the arrangement would remain invisible. Invisible was one of Victor's specialties. Across the city, Victor Hale was discovering that invisibility had limits. His phone rang repeatedly that morning, but the calls were not from clients. They were from Raymond Castillo. Victor answered the third call, but Ray's voice carried tension. Something weird happened. Victor leaned back in his chair. What kind of weird 2 Boston cops came by the garage where the job happened? Victor's expression did not change, but his eyes sharpened slightly. And they asked about a fight that night. Victor tapped a finger against the desk. What did you say that I wasn't there? Good. Ray continued. They had camera footage. Victor paused. Of what? Just the garage entrance. They couldn't see the actual hit. Victor exhaled quietly. Then it's nothing. Ray hesitated. They asked about Darren. Victor's voice hardened. Did you give them anything no good? Victor ended the call and sat still for several seconds. Police inquiries were normal after an assault. But if the victim started talking about hired attackers, the situation could become complicated. Victor picked up his phone again and dialed another number. Lawrence Whitmore answered on the second ring. Yes, Victor spoke calmly. Your situation might have drawn a little attention. Lawrence straightened slightly in his chair. What kind of attention? Police asking questions about a garage incident. That's normal, Lawrence replied quickly. It was an assault. Victor's tone remained neutral. Your wife mentioned your name. Lawrence hesitated. She implied something like that. Victor sighed softly. That's inconvenient, but not fatal. What do you mean? It means the story needs to stay simple, Victor said. Random crime. That's what it was supposed to look like. Then that's what it remains. Victor's voice became firmer. And for the next few weeks, you keep distance. From what? From me? Lawrence frowned. That won't be necessary. Victor's answer came instantly. Yes, it will. The line went quiet for a moment. Then Victor added one last sentence. If anyone asks about Hale Operational Advisory, it's a consulting firm. I already said that. Good. The call ended. Lawrence placed the phone down slowly. The first small crack of uncertainty had appeared. But it was still small. In his mind, the situation remained manageable. The attack had occurred. The message had been delivered. Yvonne had left the house. The marriage was effectively over. Across town, Yvonne Beckett was sitting in a quiet office inside the Boston Federal Building with Special Agent Claire Donovan. Stacks of documents covered the table. Bank transaction records, email logs, phone metadata. Claire slid one sheet across the table. Recognize this. Yvonne studied the document. Yes. The consulting payment. Yes. Claire tapped the line showing the transaction. Whitmore Strategic Holdings transferred the money 3 days before the assault. Yvonne nodded. That matches the notebook. Claire looked at her. It matches exactly. She leaned back in her chair. Your husband might have assumed this payment would disappear into corporate accounting. But it didn't. No. Claire tapped another document. Because Hale Operational Advisory is not a consulting firm. Yvonne looked up. What is it? Claire turned the page. A shell company, owned by Victor Hale. Yvonne said nothing. Claire continued. And Victor Hale has prior connections to several individuals with assault records. She slid another file forward. A photograph stared up from the page. Raymond Castillo. Yvonne's eyes narrowed slightly. That's him? Claire nodded. The tall one. Yes. Claire circled the name with her pen. Good. Another page appeared. Darren Pike. The scar along the jaw was visible in the photo. Yvonne pointed. The other one. Claire nodded again. Perfect. She closed the folder slowly. In 3 days, Claire said, we connected your documentation to the financial transfer. From the transfer to Victor Hale. And from Hale to the 2 men who attacked you. Yvonne studied the documents quietly. It's happening quickly. Claire smiled faintly. That's because you gave us the timeline. Outside the office, investigators were already requesting additional records. Phone data, vehicle registrations, security footage from surrounding streets. Each new piece added another thread to the case. And threads, when woven together, carefully become very difficult to cut. Across the city, Lawrence Whitmore stood in his kitchen pouring himself a drink. The glass trembled slightly in his hand. Not from fear, not yet, but from the faint realization that something about the situation felt different from what he had planned. He looked at the quiet house around him. Yvonne's absence had changed the atmosphere. The rooms felt larger, colder. He told himself that the discomfort was temporary. Soon the divorce would finalize. Soon the entire situation would disappear. But far from the brownstone inside the federal building downtown, Special Agent Claire Donovan was already placing another document into the growing case file. A bank record, a timestamp, and a payment that had been meant to solve a problem. Instead, it had become the first undeniable link between Lawrence Whitmore and the violence he believed no one would ever trace back to him. Money leaves traces even when people believe they have hidden it well. Numbers move through systems designed to record every step. Banks monitor unusual transfers. Accounting platforms store timestamps. Even the most carefully structured transactions must pass through networks that remember more than the people using them realize. 3 days after the payment from Whitmore Strategic Holdings reached the shell account connected to Hale Operational Advisory, those traces began to form a clear path. Inside a secure office at the Federal Building in Boston, Special Agent Claire Donovan stood beside a large digital display showing a financial flow diagram. Lines connected names. Boxes represented accounts. Each arrow marked a movement of money. Claire pointed to the first box, Whitmore Strategic Holdings. She tapped the screen. This is where the transfer started. Across the table, Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Torres leaned forward slightly, reviewing the timeline. Corporate account, he asked. Yes. And the payment authorization. Claire zoomed in on the record. Signed digitally by Lawrence Whitmore. Torres nodded. That's useful. Claire moved the diagram forward. The line extended to a second box. Hale Operational Advisory. Torres glanced at the information beneath the name. Registered 6 months ago. Exactly, Claire replied. Which is interesting, Torres said quietly. How so? Because it appears around the same time. Mrs. Whitmore began documenting financial changes. Claire considered that. Coincidence? Torres shook his head. I don't believe in coincidence when money is involved. Claire tapped the next arrow. The diagram expanded again. From Hale Operational Advisory, 2 smaller transfers appeared. One to a personal account registered under Victor Hale. Another to a cash withdrawal logged at a local bank branch. Claire pointed to the withdrawal record. That cash was taken out 2 days before the assault. Torres looked up. How much? Claire named the amount. Torres exhaled slowly. That's enough to pay 2 people. Yes. And those 2 people, Torres continued, are Raymond Castillo and Darren Pike. Claire nodded. We confirmed the connection this morning. How Victor Hale's phone records? Torres raised an eyebrow. Already, Claire smiled faintly. Hale isn't as careful as he thinks. She pulled another file from the folder and slid it across the table. Torres opened it. Inside were call logs. Victor Hale had spoken to Raymond Castillo 3 times the day before the assault, and once more 2 hours afterward. Torres tapped the final call entry. That one is interesting. Claire nodded. Post-event confirmation. Torres leaned back in his chair. This is starting to look very clean. Claire crossed her arms thoughtfully. Cleaner than most cases. That's because the victim built half the timeline for us. Torres closed the folder. I'd like to meet her. Yvonne. Yes. Why, Torres gave a small smile. Anyone who keeps records this detailed deserves to know how valuable they are. Across the city, Yvonne Beckett sat in a quiet conference room with a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. She had slept only a few hours the previous night. Not because of fear, but because her mind kept replaying the sequence of events that had led to the attack. Patterns. When you study patterns long enough, you begin to see where they lead before others do. Special Agent Claire Donovan entered the room and sat down across from her. We're making progress, she said. Yvonne looked up. What kind of progress? Claire placed several documents on the table. Financial confirmation. She pointed to the first sheet. This is the payment your husband authorized. Yvonne studied the line carefully. The amount matched the entry she had written weeks earlier. Claire pointed to the next page. This is the transfer from Victor Hale to Raymond Castillo. Yvonne's expression remained calm, but her eyes sharpened slightly. And the cash withdrawal? She asked. Claire nodded. That paid Darren Pike. Yvonne leaned back slightly in her chair. So it connects? Yes. Claire tapped the documents gently. Your notebook gave us the starting point. Yvonne was quiet for a moment. What happens next? Claire folded her hands. Now we prove intent. How emails, messages, phone records. Yvonne thought for a moment. There might be something. Claire waited. A conversation Lawrence had 2 weeks before the attack. What about it? He said he was meeting someone who dealt with complications. Claire smiled slightly. That sounds like Victor. Probably. Claire wrote the note down. Anything else? Yvonne considered the question carefully. Then she remembered something. There was a document. Claire looked up. What kind? A consulting invoice. For Hale Operational Advisory. Yes. Claire leaned forward. Did you see it clearly briefly? What did it say? Yvonne closed her eyes for a moment, recalling the layout of the page. Strategic Risk Consultation. Claire's smile widened slightly. That's useful. Why? Because vague descriptions are often used to hide specific services. Claire stood. I'm going to show this to Michael Torres. Yvonne nodded. As Claire left the room, Yvonne looked again at the documents on the table. For months, she had been writing details in the notebook without knowing exactly where they would lead. Now those details were becoming evidence. Across the city, Lawrence Whitmore was finishing a meeting with 2 investors in his office. He spoke confidently about new infrastructure projects and upcoming municipal contracts. To the people sitting across from him, he appeared exactly as he always had. Successful, in control, reliable. When the meeting ended, one of the investors shook his hand warmly. Looking forward to working with you, Lawrence. Likewise. After they left, Lawrence closed the office door and returned to his desk. His phone displayed 3 missed calls, 1 from Victor Hale, 2 from an unknown number. Lawrence ignored Victor's call. Instead, he dialed the unknown number. A man answered, Commonwealth Financial Compliance. Lawrence felt the faint tightening again in his chest. Yes, we're reviewing another transaction connected to Hale Operational Advisory. Lawrence forced a calm tone. What about it? Just confirming the consulting services again? Lawrence's patience began thinning. I already explained that. Yes, the voice said politely. We're just completing the file. The call ended shortly afterward. Lawrence leaned back in his chair. Something about the questions felt persistent. But he reassured himself quickly. Compliance departments ask questions. That's their job. It didn't mean anything more. Yet, far from his office inside the federal building, the case file had grown thicker. Claire Donovan returned to Michael Torres's office and placed the invoice description on the desk. Torres read it carefully. Then he smiled. Strategic Risk Consultation. Claire nodded. Creative. Torres tapped the financial chart. We now have mode of payment and perpetrators. Claire crossed her arms. What we need now is confirmation that Whitmore knew exactly what he was paying for. Torres looked up. That's where email becomes interesting. Claire understood immediately. You're thinking search warrants. Torres nodded slowly. Yes. He closed the folder. Because once we see what Lawrence Whitmore wrote before the assault. Torres paused briefly. We'll know whether this case is about suspicion. He tapped the financial chart again. Or conspiracy. And if it was conspiracy, the quiet chain of transactions that Lawrence Whitmore believed invisible would soon become the clearest evidence of all. The difference between suspicion and proof often lies in a single recording. Investigators know this well. Financial records can show motive. Timelines can reveal opportunity. But a voice captured clearly speaking without caution can remove the last remaining doubt. Special Agent Claire Donovan understood that as she walked into the interrogation room inside the Boston Federal Building. Across the metal table sat Darren Pike. He looked smaller than the photograph suggested. Without the shadow of a parking garage and the tension of an attack, Darren Pike appeared like many men investigators encountered every week, nervous, tired, and aware that the next few hours might determine the rest of his life. His hands were folded tightly together. The thin scar along his jaw was more visible now under the fluorescent lights. Claire placed a folder on the table but did not open it. Instead, she sat down slowly and observed him. How long have you known Victor Hale? She asked. Darren shifted in his chair. Couple years. What kind of work do you do for him? Odd jobs. Claire nodded. Assault is an odd job. Darren looked down. I didn't say that. Claire leaned back slightly. You don't have to. She slid a photograph across the table. Raymond Castillo. Darren stared at it. That's Ray. Yes. Claire placed another photograph beside it, a still frame taken from a parking garage camera. A tall man entering the structure. Also Ray. Darren said nothing. Claire spoke calmly. Ray has already spoken with detectives. That was not entirely true. But interrogation rooms rarely operate under perfect honesty. Darren's eyes flickered upward. What did he say? Claire folded her hands. That depends on what you tell me. Silence settled across the room. Darren shifted again. Claire waited. Time often worked in the investigator's favor. Finally, Darren spoke. It was supposed to be simple. Claire did not react outwardly. What was the job? What job? Darren sighed. The one in the garage. Claire leaned forward slightly. Explain. Darren rubbed his forehead with one hand. Victor told us it was a warning. A warning for who? Some rich guy's wife. Named Whitmore. Claire's expression remained neutral, but the recorder on the table captured every word. Who hired Victor? She asked. I don't know. Victor never told you no. Claire opened the folder now and slid a bank record across the table. This payment came from Lawrence Whitmore. Darren studied the document. That's the guy. Claire watched him carefully. Did you ever speak to him directly? No. Did Victor mention his name? Yeah. When before the job? Claire wrote the answer down. What exactly did Victor say? Darren hesitated. Claire remained silent. Eventually he spoke. He said the husband wanted the wife scared enough to leave. Claire nodded slowly. And that's what you did. That's what we tried. Claire slid another document forward. A phone log. Victor called Ray 3 times the day before the attack. Darren looked at it briefly. Yeah. And once afterward. Yeah. Claire leaned back again. What did Ray say after the job? Darren frowned. What do you mean? Claire pointed to the final call entry. What did Ray report back to Victor? Darren exhaled slowly. He said the message was delivered. Claire wrote the phrase down. Message delivered. The same language the attackers had used in the garage. The same language Yvonne had repeated in her statement. Patterns again. Claire closed the folder. Did you record any of your conversations with Victor? Darren looked surprised. No. Claire watched his face carefully. Then she said something unexpected. Ray did. Darren's head lifted instantly. But Claire reached into the folder again and placed a small digital recorder on the table. It was not actually Ray's recording. But Darren did not know that. Ray keeps records, she said calmly, just in case. Darren stared at the device. What's on it? Claire's voice remained steady. Victor talking about the Whitmore job. Silence. Darren's breathing became slightly faster. Claire let the silence stretch. Finally, Darren leaned forward. Look, I didn't plan the job. Who did Victor? Who paid Victor, the husband? Claire pressed one final question. How do you know? Darren swallowed. Because Victor told Ray the payment cleared. Claire nodded slowly. That's helpful. She turned off the recorder. The room felt different now. The tension had shifted. Darren Pike had just confirmed the chain of responsibility. Outside the interrogation room, Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Torres reviewed the live transcript as it appeared on his laptop screen. When Claire stepped into the hallway, he looked up. Good work. Claire crossed her arms. He broke quickly. Torres nodded. People usually do when they realize someone else might be talking. Claire glanced back toward the interrogation room. He thinks Ray recorded Victor. Torres smiled faintly. Did Ray number? Torres shrugged. He doesn't need to. Claire understood the point. The admission itself was enough to move the investigation forward. Torres closed the laptop and stood. Next step, Claire answered immediately. Victor Hale. Torres nodded, and after Victor, Claire did not hesitate. Lawrence Whitmore. Across the city, Lawrence Whitmore was hosting a small dinner with 2 business partners. The evening appeared perfectly ordinary. Wine glasses clinked softly. Conversation drifted across topics like municipal contracts and upcoming development projects. To the men sitting at the table, Lawrence looked confident and relaxed. But small signs of tension had begun appearing. He checked his phone more often. His responses to questions were slightly delayed. At one point, while his guests discussed a potential investment opportunity, Lawrence stepped briefly into the hallway to return a call. Victor Hale answered on the second ring. "You need to stay calm," Victor said immediately. "What's happening?" Lawrence asked. "Police have been asking questions." Lawrence's voice tightened. "About the garage?" "Yes, that's normal. Maybe." Victor paused. "But Darren Pike was picked up this morning." Lawrence felt the floor beneath the conversation shift slightly. "For what unrelated charge?" And when people get picked up," Victor said slowly, "they sometimes start talking." Silence on the line stretched. Finally, Lawrence spoke. "They don't know anything." Victor did not sound convinced. "We'll see." The call ended. Lawrence stood in the hallway for several seconds, staring at the blank phone screen. Inside the dining room, his guests continued discussing business, as if nothing had changed. But across the city inside the federal building, Special Agent Claire Donovan was placing a new item into the evidence folder. A transcript. 3 words highlighted in yellow. Message was delivered. 3 words that connected the attackers to Victor Hale, and Victor Hale to the man who believed his money had erased every trace of the crime. Legal procedure rarely moves with the drama people expect. There are no sudden announcements, no raised voices, no dramatic confrontations in crowded rooms. Instead, there are documents, signatures, quiet approvals that move through official channels one step at a time. And once those steps begin, they rarely stop. 3 days after Darren Pike's interview, Special Agent Claire Donovan walked into a federal magistrate's office with a thick folder under her arm. Inside were the pieces investigators had gathered during the previous week: financial records, phone logs, witness statements, and the transcript from Darren Pike's interview. The magistrate judge, a gray-haired woman who had spent decades reviewing federal warrants, read the first few pages without expression. She had seen many cases before. Some held together well. Others collapsed the moment they faced scrutiny. When she reached the financial timeline connecting Whitmore Strategic Holdings to Hale Operational Advisory, her pen paused briefly. Then she continued reading. 10 minutes passed. Finally, she looked up. "You're requesting 3 warrants," she said calmly. Claire nodded. 1 for Victor Hale's business and residence. 2nd, phone and email records connected to Hale Operational Advisory. And the 3rd, Claire turned to the final page, for the corporate email server used by Lawrence Whitmore. The judge studied the request carefully. "This is a significant step. Yes, you believe Whitmore knowingly financed the assault?" Claire answered without hesitation. "The evidence suggests conspiracy." The judge tapped the transcript page. "Based on this witness statement and the financial transfers and the timeline." The judge closed the folder. For several seconds, the room remained silent. Finally, she reached for her pen. Probable cause established. One by one, the warrants were signed. The quiet sound of the pen touching paper marked a turning point in the investigation. Outside the courthouse, Claire immediately called Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Torres. They're signed. Torres did not sound surprised. "Good. What's the order?" Torres answered calmly. "Hale first." Claire nodded. "Agreed." Then Whitmore. Because once search warrants exist, investigations move quickly. Across the city, Victor Hale was pouring coffee in the small kitchen of his office when 2 dark SUVs pulled to a stop outside the building. Victor noticed them immediately. People in his line of work developed instincts about vehicles. These were not delivery trucks. They were government. The front door opened seconds later. 3 agents stepped inside. Claire Donovan walked in last. "Victor Hale?" she asked. Victor set his coffee down slowly. "Yes." Claire held up a document. Federal search warrant. Victor's expression remained calm. "For what? Your business records, financial accounts, and communications?" Victor nodded once. "I see." Agents moved quietly through the office, opening file cabinets and photographing documents. Victor watched them without speaking. Claire stepped closer. "You can call your attorney," she said calmly. Victor gave a faint smile. "I probably will." She studied his face. "You knew this might happen." Victor shrugged slightly. "People in my line of work consider possibilities." Claire nodded. "Good." She held up another document. "This one allows us to review all communications between Hale, Operational Advisory, and Whitmore Strategic Holdings." Victor's smile faded slightly. Across the room, one of the agents spoke. "Agent Donovan." Claire turned. The agent held up a printed email. Claire walked over and read it quickly. The message had been sent from Lawrence Whitmore's corporate account to Victor Hale. Subject: consultation follow-up. The text was short. "We discussed the situation. I want it handled quietly. No complications." Claire read the line twice. Then she handed the page to Victor. "Does this look familiar?" Victor glanced at it briefly. He did not answer. Silence often functions as an answer. Across town, Lawrence Whitmore sat in his office reviewing a contract proposal when his phone vibrated. The number belonged to Victor Hale. Lawrence answered immediately. "Yes." Victor's voice was unusually calm. "You might want to speak with your lawyer." Lawrence frowned. "What happened? Federal agents are in my office." The words landed like a sudden drop in temperature. "For what search warrant?" Lawrence's fingers tightened slightly around the phone. "That doesn't mean anything." Victor's tone remained neutral. "They're looking at our emails." The silence that followed lasted several seconds. Lawrence finally spoke. "There's nothing in those emails." Victor did not respond immediately. Then he said quietly, "You might want to read them again." The call ended. Lawrence sat very still in his chair. Across his desk, the glass walls of the office reflected the skyline of Boston. Everything outside appeared normal. But something inside the room had shifted. He opened his email, scrolled, found the message. "I want it handled quietly." The sentence suddenly looked different than it had when he wrote it. Across the city inside the federal building, Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Torres read the same message. He leaned back slowly in his chair. Claire Donovan stood across from the desk. "That's our intent," she said. Torres nodded. "Yes." He tapped the email. "This removes ambiguity." Claire crossed her arms. "You think it's enough?" Torres smiled faintly. "It's enough to ask Lawrence Whitmore some questions." Later that afternoon, 2 federal agents entered the offices of Whitmore Strategic Holdings. Lawrence's assistant looked up nervously as they approached the reception desk. "Can I help you?" "Yes," one of the agents said calmly. "We're here to speak with Mr. Whitmore." Minutes later, Lawrence stood in the conference room facing the 2 agents. Their expressions were polite, professional. "We have a few questions regarding a consulting contract," one agent said. Lawrence forced a calm smile. "What contract? Hale Operational Advisory?" The room felt smaller suddenly. That was a legitimate consulting engagement. The agent nodded. "That's what we're here to discuss." Lawrence's voice remained steady. "Do I need a lawyer for this conversation?" "That's your choice." Lawrence considered the question carefully. Then he said yes. The agents nodded. "Then we'll continue another time." They left quietly. But the moment they stepped outside, the direction of the case had already changed. Because the investigation had now reached the stage where evidence no longer needed interpretation. Money had moved. Emails had been written. Witnesses had spoken. And once those pieces align under legal procedure, the final steps rarely take long. The story did not become public all at once. In cities like Boston, reputations rarely collapse in a single dramatic moment. Instead, they erode quietly as information begins moving through the small, tightly connected networks that shape public perception. The first hint appeared in a legal filing. It was a short document submitted in federal court late on a Thursday afternoon. An official notice related to an ongoing criminal investigation involving assault for hire and financial conspiracy. Most people never saw the document, but journalists who monitored federal court filings noticed it immediately. By Friday morning, a brief article appeared on the website of a regional legal affairs publication. The headline was cautious. Federal investigation examines alleged assault linked to Boston investment executive. The article did not mention Lawrence Whitmore by name, not yet, but it described a consulting payment, a shell company, and a violent attack that investigators believed had been ordered as a message. Within hours, the story began circulating quietly through Boston's business community. Law firms forwarded the article to clients. Financial analysts shared the link in private email threads. And by mid-afternoon, one of the investors who regularly attended Whitmore Strategic Holdings meetings sent Lawrence a message. "You should see this." Lawrence read the article twice. The words were careful, the accusations indirect. But the outline of the story was unmistakable. Someone had started connecting the pieces. He closed the laptop slowly. Across the office floor, several employees worked quietly at their desks, unaware that the man who signed their paychecks had just seen the first public crack in the life he had constructed. His phone rang moments later. The caller ID displayed the name of his attorney, Robert Klein. Lawrence answered immediately. "Yes." Klein's voice was calm but serious. "You've seen the article, yes. It's only the beginning." "What do you mean there's a federal case forming?" Klein said. "And once court documents start appearing, reporters will dig for names." Lawrence stood and walked toward the window. "They don't have anything." Klein paused. "They have your email." Lawrence said nothing. "And they have Darren Pike's statement." A faint pulse of tension moved through Lawrence's chest. That statement means nothing. It means enough to justify further investigation. Lawrence stared out at the skyline. "What do you recommend? Stay quiet." "I already am. Stay very quiet." The call ended shortly afterward. But the quiet Klein recommended was already dissolving outside the office walls. Because later that evening, another publication, larger this time, released a second article. This one was less cautious. The headline carried a name: "Whitmore Strategic Holdings CEO linked to assault investigation." The story spread quickly. Phones began ringing across the company offices. Investors called asking questions. One of the company's board members requested an emergency meeting. Lawrence read the article once, then again. The words felt colder this time. Because now the narrative had a face, his. Across the city, Yvonne Beckett sat in a quiet waiting room outside a federal courtroom. She wore a dark jacket and simple blouse. Her bruises had begun fading, though faint traces remained along her cheekbone. Special Agent Claire Donovan sat beside her. "Are you ready?" Claire asked. Yvonne nodded. "What exactly happens in there?" "A deposition," Claire said. "You'll answer questions about the attack. From whom attorneys?" Yvonne absorbed that information calmly. "And Lawrence? He'll be there." For the first time that day, Yvonne looked slightly surprised. "In the same room?" "Yes." She was silent for a moment. Then she nodded again. "That's fine." Claire studied her carefully. "Most people feel nervous about this part. I'm not most people." Claire smiled faintly. "That's becoming clear." Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was controlled and formal. Lawrence Whitmore sat at one end of the long table beside his attorney. His posture remained composed, but the lines of tension around his eyes had deepened. When Yvonne entered the room, the air shifted subtly. Neither of them spoke. The judge entered moments later. The proceedings began with quiet procedural statements. Then Yvonne was sworn in. She sat upright in the witness chair, her hands folded calmly in her lap. The prosecutor began with simple questions. "Please state your name for the record." "Yvonne Beckett. Were you previously married to Lawrence Whitmore?" "Yes." "Do you recall the night of August 24th? "Yes." "Please describe what happened." Yvonne spoke clearly. She described the parking garage, the two men, the message they delivered. The phrase echoed again in the courtroom. "Your husband asked us to deliver a message." The prosecutor nodded. "Did you previously document events leading up to this attack?" "Yes." "Can you explain what those records contained? Financial changes, conversations, names?" Did one name appear repeatedly? Yes. What name? Victor. The prosecutor placed the gray notebook on the evidence table. Is this the notebook you kept? Yes. The judge examined it briefly. Then the prosecutor asked the final question. Mrs. Beckett, are you making these statements today in anger? Yvonne looked directly toward the front of the courtroom. No. Why are you making them? Because they are true. The room remained silent. Across the table, Lawrence Whitmore stared at the notebook. A simple object, gray cover, unremarkable. But inside it were months of quiet observations. Each entry another thread connecting him to the moment he believed no one would ever trace back to him. The judge closed the notebook. The hearing concluded shortly afterward. Outside the courthouse, reporters had already gathered. But Yvonne did not stop to speak with them. She walked calmly past the cameras. No dramatic statement, no accusations shouted into microphones. Only silence. Because the evidence was already speaking. And as the legal process moved forward, the story no longer belonged to speculation or rumor. It belonged to records, documents, testimony, things that do not need to raise their voices to be heard. Desperation rarely arrives all at once. It begins as irritation, then concern, then the quiet understanding that the situation is moving beyond control. For Lawrence Whitmore, that understanding arrived late on a Sunday evening. The house in Back Bay had grown unusually quiet since Yvonne left. The silence that once felt like relief now carried a different weight. Something hollow, something unfinished. Lawrence sat alone at the long dining table, his laptop open in front of him. Several documents covered the screen. Legal briefs, email transcripts, financial statements his attorney had sent earlier that afternoon. Each one told the same story from a slightly different angle. The money trail, the consulting payment, the witness statement from Darren Pike. And the email. I want it handled quietly. At first glance, the sentence seemed harmless. It did not mention violence directly. It did not contain instructions that could be interpreted as criminal. But in the context of everything else, it had become dangerous. Very dangerous. Lawrence leaned back in his chair and closed the laptop slowly. Across the room, the house lights reflected faintly against the tall windows overlooking the quiet street. The world outside continued normally. Cars passed. Neighbors walked their dogs. But inside the house, Lawrence could feel the structure of his carefully managed life beginning to fracture. His phone vibrated. It was Robert Klein again. Lawrence answered immediately. Yes. Klein did not waste time. We need to talk about options. What kind of options damage control? Lawrence's jaw tightened. I didn't commit a crime. That's not the only issue, Klein replied calmly. The public narrative is shifting. Lawrence stood and walked toward the kitchen. What are you suggesting, a private settlement? With whom, your wife? Lawrence stopped walking. That's ridiculous. Not entirely, Klein said. If she withdraws certain claims or statements, the prosecution loses momentum. She won't. You don't know that. Lawrence exhaled slowly. What exactly would this settlement look like? Financial compensation? For what? For the marriage? Lawrence laughed quietly. That's expensive silence. Yes, Klein said. But sometimes silence is the cheapest solution. After the call ended, Lawrence stood alone in the kitchen for several minutes. Then he returned to the dining table and opened his laptop again. He began writing an email. The message was carefully worded. Short, controlled, professional. Yvonne. This situation has become unnecessarily complicated. I believe it would be in both of our interests to resolve matters privately. I am prepared to discuss a settlement that would allow both of us to move forward without further public conflict. Let me know if you are willing to speak. Lawrence. He read the message twice. Then he pressed send. Across the city, Yvonne Beckett sat in a quiet apartment Megan Carter had offered her temporarily. The space was modest compared to the brownstone she had left behind. But it felt calm, ordered, peaceful. Her phone vibrated softly on the table beside her. She looked at the screen. Lawrence. The email opened slowly. She read the message once, then again. There was no anger in her expression, only recognition. Lawrence was still trying to manage the ending, still trying to turn the story into something controlled and negotiable. Yvonne closed the email and placed the phone back on the table. She did not reply. The next morning, Special Agent Claire Donovan arrived at the federal office to find a new document waiting on her desk. An email, forwarded from Yvonne. Claire read the message carefully. Then she walked down the hallway to Michael Torres's office. Torres looked up as she entered. "What's new?" Claire handed him the printed email. Torres read it slowly, then he smiled. "He's trying to buy silence." Claire nodded. Too late. Torres tapped the page thoughtfully. "This is interesting." "Why?" "Because it shows consciousness of exposure." Claire crossed her arms. "You think it strengthens the case?" Torres nodded. "Absolutely." He placed the document into the evidence folder. At this point, he said calmly, "There's nothing left for Whitmore to control." Across Boston, the board members of Whitmore Strategic Holdings gathered for an emergency meeting. The atmosphere in the conference room felt different than any meeting before. More formal, more distant. Lawrence stood at the head of the table. "I understand the concerns," he said, "but this investigation will resolve itself." One of the board members leaned forward. "The company cannot wait indefinitely." Lawrence felt the shift instantly. "What are you suggesting?" Another board member spoke quietly. "We believe it's best if you step aside temporarily." The words landed with quiet finality. Lawrence stared at them. "You're asking me to resign," the first board member replied. "We're asking you to protect the company." The meeting ended shortly afterward. When Lawrence left the building, reporters were already waiting across the street. Cameras pointed in his direction. Questions shouted from the sidewalk. He ignored them, but their presence confirmed what he had begun to suspect. The story was no longer private. The ending was no longer negotiable. Across town, Yvonne Beckett walked through a small park near the Charles River. Autumn had begun arriving in Boston. The first leaves were turning color. She sat on a bench overlooking the water. For months, she had watched Lawrence manage every detail of their shared life, every account, every decision, every narrative. Now the process had reversed. The story was moving through legal procedure, through evidence, through institutions designed to follow facts rather than appearances. Yvonne watched the slow movement of the river for several minutes. Then she stood and walked away, because the outcome no longer depended on confrontation. The evidence would speak soon enough. And when it did, the ending Lawrence Whitmore tried to control would finally arrive. Just not the one he had planned. The final stage of a case rarely feels dramatic to the people inside it. There are no orchestras swelling in the background, no cinematic declarations. Instead, the end arrives through procedure, one document after another, one hearing after another, until the structure of the truth becomes impossible to avoid. By early November, the air in Boston had turned cold. Leaves gathered along the sidewalks of Back Bay, and the harbor wind carried the sharp edge of winter. Inside the federal courthouse, the atmosphere was steady, controlled, and almost quiet. Lawrence Whitmore sat at the defense table beside Robert Klein. The months since the investigation began had changed him in subtle but unmistakable ways. The confident composure he once carried into every room had thinned. His movements were slower now, his gaze more cautious. Across the room, Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Torres reviewed the final documents of the case. Special Agent Claire Donovan sat behind him, observing the courtroom with the same patient focus she had carried throughout the investigation. And a few rows back, Yvonne Beckett watched silently. She had chosen a seat away from the center of the room. Not hidden, but not central either. The proceedings that morning were brief. The judge summarized the charges in calm, deliberate language. Conspiracy to commit assault, Use of interstate financial channels to facilitate criminal activity. Witness intimidation. Each count was read without emphasis. The facts were already in the record. Bank transfers, emails, call logs. Testimony from Darren Pike. Documentation collected over months. None of it needed dramatic interpretation. When the judge finished reading the charges, he looked toward Lawrence Whitmore. "Mr. Whitmore, how do you plead?" Lawrence's attorney spoke quietly beside him. Lawrence nodded once. Not guilty. The response was expected. Trials often begin that way. But the evidence assembled in the months leading to that morning had already shaped the direction the case would take. Torres stood and addressed the court. "The government intends to demonstrate that Mr. Whitmore knowingly financed a violent assault intended to intimidate his spouse into silence and separation." His voice remained steady. "We will show that this assault was arranged through financial intermediaries and confirmed through written communications." He gestured toward the evidence table. "The documentation speaks clearly." The judge nodded. The hearing concluded soon after. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited again. But as before, Yvonne Beckett did not stop to address them. She walked quietly past the cameras and down the courthouse steps. Across the street, the trees lining the park had lost most of their leaves. Winter was approaching. Several weeks later, the trial concluded. The process had unfolded methodically. Witnesses spoke. Evidence was presented. The email from Lawrence Whitmore to Victor Hale appeared on the screen inside the courtroom. "I want it handled quietly." The financial timeline followed. From Whitmore Strategic Holdings to Hale Operational Advisory. From Hale to Raymond Castillo and Darren Pike. Each transfer dated. Each amount recorded. Each connection confirmed. When Darren Pike testified, his voice carried none of the bravado he once showed in the parking garage. "It was a warning job," he said. "Victor told us the husband wanted the wife scared enough to leave." The courtroom remained silent. The jurors took notes. Raymond Castillo testified next. His statement matched Darren's. Then the gray notebook appeared, the same one Yvonne had filled quietly over months. Entry after entry was read aloud. Dates, amounts, names. The patterns she had observed long before the attack. When Yvonne herself took the stand, the prosecutor asked only a few questions. "Mrs. Beckett, why did you keep these records?" "Because I noticed patterns." "Were you preparing for legal action?" "No." "Why did you continue writing them?" Yvonne paused briefly. "Because facts matter." The courtroom remained silent after that answer. When the defense attempted to challenge her testimony, the questions sounded thin compared to the evidence already presented. After several days of testimony, the jury began deliberation. It did not take long. 2 days later, the courtroom filled again. Lawrence Whitmore stood beside his attorney as the jury returned. The foreperson rose. "On the charge of conspiracy to commit assault?" A pause. "We find the defendant guilty." The remaining verdicts followed, one after another. Guilty. The judge scheduled sentencing for a later date. But the essential conclusion had already arrived. The structure Lawrence Whitmore built his reputation, his business influence, his carefully managed narrative, had collapsed under the weight of its own records. After the courtroom cleared, Yvonne remained seated for a moment longer. Claire Donovan approached quietly. "It's finished," she said. Yvonne nodded. "Yes." Claire studied her. "You don't look relieved." Yvonne considered the question carefully. Relief isn't really the right word. What is clarity? Claire nodded slowly. "That's fair." They walked together toward the courthouse exit. Outside, the air felt colder than it had earlier that morning. Boston's winter had arrived. Across the street, the reporters were still there. Cameras ready, questions waiting. But Yvonne Beckett did not walk toward them. Instead, she turned down the quieter side of the street and continued walking along the river. The city moved around her, as it always had. Cars passed. People hurried between offices. Nothing about the world outside suggested that a chapter of her life had just ended. But inside her mind, the noise that had once filled every corner of the marriage had finally gone quiet. Lawrence Whitmore would face the consequences of the choices he made. The courts would determine the rest. But Yvonne had no interest in watching the aftermath. At the edge of the river path, she stopped briefly and looked out across the water. The surface reflected the gray winter sky, calm, steady. Then she turned and walked away. Not in triumph, not in anger, only with the quiet dignity she had carried through every step of the story. Because some victories are not loud. They are simply the moment when the truth is finally allowed to stand on its own. For a long time, people believed that power belonged to the loudest voice in the room. The person who controlled the money. The person who controlled the story. The person who believed consequences could always be managed. But stories like Yvonne Beckett's remind us of something quieter. Truth rarely arrives with spectacle. It builds slowly in notes written after midnight, in receipts saved without explanation, in details remembered long after others forget them. Yvonne never shouted. She never chased revenge. She never tried to humiliate the man who tried to destroy her. She simply observed. She documented. And when the time came, she allowed the facts to speak. In the end, the law did not need anger to understand what happened. It only needed evidence. And sometimes the strongest form of justice is not the punishment itself, but the quiet moment when someone walks away with their dignity intact. If this story stayed with you, feel free to share your thoughts below. Many people watching these stories come from different parts of the world. It's always interesting to see where everyone is listening from, so if you'd like, tell us your city and what time it is there right now. And if you appreciate stories about truth, quiet strength, and justice that unfold slowly but surely, you're welcome to subscribe so you won't miss the next one. Sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones where someone refuses to become what hurt them and simply chooses to walk forward.